Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dania. In this week's episode, I was excited to welcome Carlos Colares. Carlos is a medical toxicologist and occupational medicine physician who turned into a psychometrician, educationalist, and now entrepreneur. He moved from Brazil to the Netherlands to bring computerized adaptive testing to Dutch medical students, to popularize alternatives to multiple choice questions, and to explore cognitive diagnostic modeling, a new approach to assessment for learning. Recently, he left his tenured position at Maastricht University to start his online course to help researchers with quantitative data analysis, educational measurement, and psychological assessment. In this episode, Carlos walks us through his journey and why he was passionate about becoming an educationalist and entrepreneur. Carlos also describes the challenges we often encounter with testing mechanisms in the education system. Carlo expands on psychometrics and cognitive diagnostic modeling, and we discuss what people need to look for when reviewing the validity and reliability of research findings. I was excited to speak with Carlos on this episode because of what I got from it, but because also his passion for his work is obvious. I also wanted to help understand the nuance behind research work that often is not discussed. There are a lot of discussions where people cite research results. However, it is important to review some of these details to truly determine the validity and reliability of these research findings before we can make conclusions. I hope you also get a lot out of this episode, and if at the end, if you could leave a 5-star review, I would truly appreciate it. All right, Carlos, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me again, giving this a second shot. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here and have this conversation with me. I'm really excited about what we're going to cover today for personal reasons and what I'd like to share with the listeners. But before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity to let the listeners know a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do.
Okay, well, I am originally a Brazilian medical doctor who became a Dutch entrepreneur. But that's it. In the middle, I was a university professor in Maastricht, but it really started when I was 8 years old, I think. So I take the liberty of going back all the way to my childhood to say that, yeah, sometimes, you do things and the pieces will only fall together at a later moment in your life. Uh, so I started, I think, um, doing the thing that I ended up doing for the rest of my life when I was 8, when I created this educational game, which is a kind of computerized math test that I presented on a science fair. I did it on a 8-bit computer with 32K of memory, of RAM memory. And I had to use cassette tapes to store the software.
Yeah.
Which is amazing, right? Nowadays, you think of cassette tapes like they don't even exist, I think, anymore, except for, highly sophisticated applications. But still, that thing that attracted a lot of students because they all wanted to play with that thing that appeared like a video game. Um, that thing ended up being the thing I did for most of my adult lifetime, which is eight um, virtual environments that mix a bit of assessment and a bit of education. The idea of using technology and some instructional design together with psychometrics, which
Right.
is this discipline that aims to measure this kind of invisible realm, which is the human mind, right?
Right.
So the idea is to combine insights from a lot of things, but especially applying psychometrics, to technology enhanced learning and assessment, of course.
Right.
And more recently, after I left a 10-year tenure in Maastricht University, I uh, opened, together with some friends in Brazil and elsewhere in the world, this new initiative called the Psychometrics Academy. And the
Hmm.
idea is to teach not only psychometrics, but also statistics. So people who are into quantitative data analysis, to teach those things for free, um, online on an Instagram profile with daily insights, daily posts, but also in this premium platform for people who want to know more and who can pay a bit. It's not, so expensive
Right.
compared to other courses out there. I think we are doing a good job in terms of trying to make the ticket price affordable for most people, which is still a challenge,
Right.
right? We are still struggling because it's always a tough balance between making a profit and doing what you like in a sustainable way, right? And I still perceive that it is still expensive. It is still too expensive. If I could, I would, lower the prices, but reality is there, right? I still need to make a living, and even though the Psychometrics Academy has still not turned into a profit, I can say I'm having, the fun of my life,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
being able to help people worldwide in all continents with their, statistical questions or psychometric questions. You know, it's like helping myself in the past when I was still struggling and there was nobody else there to help me. So the
Hmm.
idea of, creating this profile, but also gathering together with, a community of like-minded people, was to make sure that people who want to learn those things, who want to go more into quantitative data analysis, who want to go more into statistics, who want to go deeper into psychometrics, that they will never need to feel alone again. And I
Right.
think this mission has been accomplished already. Um, the idea is to keep growing, right? I wish I could grow even further. But one of the ideas is to make this initiative more known elsewhere. So thank you for opening this space for me, Furkan.
Yeah. Yeah. You're welcome. And yeah, when we last talked, you had mentioned that we'll come back to psychometrics here in a bit, but you'd mentioned that on your journey as a medical doctor, you were having to do a lot of lab analysis and tests, and often it also required testing on animals, which, for you was a huge conflict personally. Why just help us kind of understand why that was such a conflict for you, and what allowed you to get out of there from that.
Well, it was an interesting experience because I had just graduated as a medical doctor. I moved from a smaller state called Santa Catarina, which is in the southern part of Brazil. I moved all the way to São Paulo,
Mhm.
and there I started work as a medical toxicologist. So I started working in this poison control center where I had to take phone calls from other doctors across the city, but also across other cities, across the country, not only in the São Paulo state. So it was a busy environment because we also had to take care of the patients who appeared in the ER. So a lot of drug overdoses, suicide attempts, tough things, right? Tough
Right.
things that make you value human life differently, I think.
Hmm.
because, I was always placed into those life death situations, um, kind of frequently. And then when I saw, the number of mice or rats that were being killed for certain postgraduate thesis, I thought, oh, this is too much. I mean, there was one particular PhD that more than 1,000 mice were killed. Too much,
Yeah.
I thought. And then I thought, why this is all about? I mean, uh, the idea was to prove certain toxicity in mice, and to unveil certain mechanisms that could be going on, especially in terms of neurotoxicity, which became another big chapter in my life. Because
Right.
in the end, this was the reason why I started studying psychometrics, right? That I realized that most substances out there, including medications, but also, solvents, metals, you name it, most things are neurotoxic, and this subtle neurotoxicity might influence your health, especially
Mhm.
your nervous function, all your nervous system, both central and peripheral. So the idea was to check, if this possibility, this idea of killing so many animals, you know, uh, if I could get around this somehow. And the way I could get around it was to propose to my supervisor, why can't I study humans instead of mice?
Yeah.
Right? Why can't I subvert a bit the logic here in the department that focuses on implementing, the same toxicity model for different substances,
Right.
and this way they can get a lot of publications. And then I thought, I'm not here for my curriculum vitae. I'm not here, to get more stamps in a document. I'm here to learn things that are difficult.
Yeah.
I'm here to learn things that are new, and maybe to create some new knowledge instead of, just replicating things to get more publications and more citations. And in the
Hmm.
end, this was perhaps my first conflict in the academic world, because I realized that most people do the right thing, which is to publish and do scientific studies, but not for the right reasons. And
Right.
not sometimes, doing this for the sake of seeking the truth, or for, enhancing something for the world, for
Hmm.
the, the greater good, so to say. It's just, to get a thicker CV, and the idea of just publishing for getting more citations never really attracted me at all.
Right.
After all, the things you write, the things you write are kind of a thing that you leave as a legacy for the world,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And it's also a legacy of your ignorance a bit. So the more you write, the more you show how much you don't know.
Right.
So how can you portray yourself in such a way that the things that you really think that are meaningful are going to withstand the test of time?
Right.
Um, so usually I don't write too much. Compared to some colleagues, my publication record is not that big.
Hmm.
Um, but everything I wrote, I'm proud of.
Right.
Even when there was, some divergence of opinions between co-authors, because that thing can happen. Sometimes there's a divergence between the authors about the methods, things like that. But in the
Yes.
end, the idea is, to make sure that a message that is going to be useful for society as a whole will get out there.
Yeah.
So in a way, I think um, I can feel kind of proud of my accomplishments. You know, it's perhaps a sin because, they say that pride is a sin. It's perhaps
Yeah.
the Pandora's box that opens the door for other sins to happen. So I can say maybe that I'm happy of having been able to, you know, be, be in the right moment, in the right time. I think here in the Netherlands, I can be proud of many things. For example, the development of computerized adaptive progress tests for medical students. So nowadays, all medical schools in the Netherlands, they use this large item bank in which all the difficulties of each question is known already beforehand.
Right.
And it's calculated in such a way that it is, robust enough for us to keep using it for a long time. And uh, a first year student, for example, who is starting medical school will tend to get easier items than a student who is on the last year. And the idea was to increase reliability in the beginning. And after some time, I realized that, you know, bringing this technology here to the Netherlands, um, and providing access to, this technology for so many students. We are talking about 10,000 students, I think, more or less, just in the Netherlands. I'm not counting the students in other countries. And the idea in the beginning was just reliability, okay.
Yeah.
But later on, I realized that it was more than just better psychometrics. It was something especially useful and fruitful in terms of how can I say that, optimizing learning.
Right.
So by adjusting the difficulty and also the content of the questions that are being shown to you in a test, um, we align the test better with learning theories like
Yeah.
constructivism, like social cognitive theory, and even a cognitive load theory. So there is a good match between this technology and learning theory. So I came up with this idea that maybe we should have more online learning environments that can use this kind of algorithm to optimize learning.
Yeah.
And the idea is that we can make this useful and applicable also to less privileged countries. Because what I see is this kind of huge divide in terms of countries that have access to these technologies. In a way, I can say that this computerized adaptive testing technology is kind of primitive form of artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So the gap between rich and poor countries cannot grow too much because otherwise there is a big risk that we will, by not providing access to all countries, that will end up having, a huge inequity out there.
Mhm.
So I'm eager to support initiatives that can increase access to more students, to more young people, from all ages, to have access to those algorithms that can make a strategic use of assessment
Right.
to foster learning, to optimize learning, to accelerate learning. That's the idea. And
Yeah.
and and maybe if I can add to that, make assessment something less punitive, less traumatic,
Right.
make assessment something, even fun. So that's, the dream, the dreamy Carlos talking.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I do want to come back to the assessments piece, but you touched on many things I wanted to explore with you today. So, we talked about psychometrics, so I want to get into that as well. But the whole notion of data and the idea of publishing, right? So, I one of the things I wanted to understand is so there is that bias or tendency to make the data fit your hypothesis so then you can publish, right? Which is, to your point, could be problematic because you're presenting a hypothesis that may not be correct. And one of the things I try to focus on, because when I was doing my MBA, I also, did a lot of statistics. So I have a fairly basic understanding, but often you kind of look at research data and people will use the conclusions and run with it. But, I have this tendency to ask people or even look at, okay, well, what was the sample size? How broad was the sample? Was it representative? And is the data, to your point earlier, reliable and valid? And what conclusions can you draw based on that? So, this is kind of a maybe two or three fold question, but perhaps we can kind of at a very as a starting point, we can go through what is psychometrics, right? You talked about statistical analysis, but what is the science here or the art for that matter? And how can we be more mindful of how the data is being represented?
Wow, there are so many questions in one. So
Yeah,
please remind me if I forget some of
sure,
them.
sure.
I will start by trying to define what psychometrics is.
Yeah.
Well, some people say it's a branch of psychology. Some people say it's a branch of statistics.
Yeah.
But I would prefer to say that it is the place where those two disciplines converge,
Right.
right? So we have many mathematicians who became psychometricians, but we also have many psychologists who became psychometricians.
Hmm.
People say that unless you publish in Psychometrica, which is the main journal in the field, you cannot call yourself psychometrician. But the fact is that most psychometricians are applied psychometricians who apply, the techniques that the geniuses out there create for us. And
Hmm.
the main task of psychometrics is to make sure that our tests are valid and reliable. When we're talking about validity, I'm talking usually about content and
Hmm.
how much the content of our test is measuring what it intends to measure. So
Yes.
if I intend to measure, let's say, emotional intelligence, okay, how can I measure that? Is it going to be a questionnaire? Maybe a self-reported measure is not going to be so good as if I create scenarios, for example, with situations that are resembling real situations, and I give some options for the person to choose what he or she thinks he or she would do. Perhaps
Right.
increasing the level of authenticity a bit, we can have more validity. So validity has all to do with, am I getting the targets? Am I, measuring well what I'm intending to measure,
Yeah.
or am I really measuring what I'm intending to measure? And then reliability has more to do with the precision or accuracy of the measure and how much this measure is free from measurement error. Because,
Hmm.
it's different from a clock. It's different from a thermometer, where, you have a very direct nature of measurement there. With questionnaires or educational assessments, it's much different, right? So you have a
Right.
much more indirect measure there, and you have to be able to test the test or
Yeah. Yeah.
test the questionnaire. So in my view, a lot of people are using bad measures out there to make important decisions for people,
Right.
like professional licensing, selection to jobs, things out there. And sometimes you have psychometricians in certain places helping with this kind of process.
Right.
But in most places, you don't. Most places worldwide still, don't have much quality assurance around the construction of the test or even the test questions, the
Yeah.
test items. And we see that in places where you have this care, there is more importance given to things like fairness, for example, right? Because if
Yeah.
you have, let's say, two students. One is a boy, one is a girl, and they are known to have the same level of knowledge. but in a subset of questions, we can see that the boys are performing better. And
Right.
then when we check those items mathematically, we see that the content of those items were more related to boyish activities, let's say skateboarding. So that
Mhm.
could have explained the difference in the performance of those questions that were perhaps with a more boyish content. And that has nothing to do with knowledge about content that was being measured. It was more related about knowledge
Right.
on skateboarding. So we can use psychometrics, this special kind of math that we use to assess the quality of the test, to see if there is some kind of bias, some kind of unfairness against specific subgroups of students. And we can also check the performance of the test as a whole. For example, if we think about reliability, I always, the first time I had to work, that's a funny story, if you allow me to tell.
Yeah, of
The
course.
the first time, the first time I had study, for real psychometrics was when the dean of the medical school I was working at that moment in Brazil, he said, "Carlos, I have a problem here. I know you know psychometrics. You already told me in your interview. So I have the situation here where the grades in this test could go from 0 to 10, and the maximum grade was 4. The average was 1.7. So everybody flunked, everybody failed. And I would like you to inspect this test, do a psychometric analysis, check the content of the questions, and then you report to me."
Yeah.
So I estimated the reliability of this test to be 0.36 according to a reliability coefficient out there. In practice, that means that from the total score variance, 36% can be construed as signal, but 64% could be construed as noise.
Mm.
Means that reliabilities below zero point 0.5
Right.
have more noise than signal, which was the case with that test. And then when I checked the content of the test, it was outrageously complicated for students in year one. They were all year one students, and they were asked questions like, explain the physiology of the kidneys, which is,
Right.
you can write an entire book chapter
Yeah, yeah.
explaining the physiology of the kidneys. And this seems, so unfair because the feedback the students were being given was just too superficial, too easy, or not deep enough. And then, I thought these students were really, in not in terms of, lacking knowledge. The problem was not lack of knowledge. The problem was that the teachers were not doing their role correctly. They were not specifying exactly what they wanted from the students. So they really point out the omissions in the answers. So it was badly written, badly corrected, and there was not so much care, So there I understood that I had a powerful thing at my hand, something that I
Hmm.
used to use for, the neurobehavioral testing of occupationally exposed patients, patients that were
Hmm.
exposed to toxins affecting the nervous system. I realized that if I use this approach, the psychometrics, if I started to use psychometric analysis for education, that I would have a powerful thing at my hand. Of course, uh, it's not just about psychometrics, right? When we talk about assessment, nowadays we understand that, what's in there in a number, right?
Yep.
And most tests still are linked to this idea that you have to have a score. And
Mm.
one of the insights we get after studying a lot of psychometrics is that um, validity and reliability, they are kind of something you cannot reconcile. I don't even know how to say that. because the more
Right.
you expand your content to make it more comprehensive, the lower will be the correlations between the items, which will make the reliability go down. And you have
Yep.
to have both. You have to have reliability and validity at the same time. But if
Of
you
course.
add too many specific things in your test to make it more comprehensive, a more representative sample of the content you want to assess, um, you will have, more dimensions being measured there. And then summing everything up as if we were, adding apples and oranges and then giving a grade like 7. Oh, you
Yep.
passed, right? But this logic is not logic when we think about highly specialized professions that really have to have a higher level of safety. So just passing the cut score doesn't make it. For example,
Mhm.
imagine a pilot, an airplane pilot,
Yep.
who needs to become, a professional pilot, and he has to do the simulation test. And in our logic, our current educational assessment logic or illogic, um, imagine that this pilot passes the first 2 tasks, which were, taking off and flying at high altitude. But in the last task, which is landing, the plane crashes, explodes, and everybody dies. But in our
Yeah.
logic, he would get a 6.6, 2 out of 3. In most scenarios, he would pass. He might even get a rounded up number and get a 7,
Right.
right? But that's not logic. So
Yeah.
in most educational settings, students are trained to pass the cut score, but no one is really interested about developing excellence.
Right.
So how can we steer education and assessment in such a way that we can stimulate this excellence and not just passing the good score, right? Because
Yeah.
passing the good score might be difficult for some people, but it might still not be enough. And the
Yeah.
idea here is then, because of these psychometric insights, right, to make room for, how can I say that, more frequent, but less, um, how can I say that? More frequent but lower stakes assessments in educational settings so that we can give more support to the students, more feedback
Yeah.
before the judgments. Because
Mhm.
now the situation is that we give a lot of lessons, the students are asked to memorize, and then if they memorize well, they will pass because most questions are still measuring your recall, your capacity
Yeah.
of recalling memorized factual informations.
Yep.
And very little is related to, authentic tasks that are really going to be, useful. And I'm not just talking about educational, um, or professional education, higher education. I'm even talking about, basic education, fundamental
Yeah.
education. We still have too much focus on memorization and too little application of knowledge being measured,
Yep.
right? So the more we can increase the level of authenticity in our assessments, the higher is the probability that our validity evidence is also going to be good, right? So it is a matter of increasing the level of authenticity. And by increasing gradually the level of authenticity, I think we can also optimize learning. So giving more support, giving more useful feedback, meaningful feedback before the time of judgment, um, or before the time of a pass-fail decision. Um, I think this would become more human. Um, it is something that it's not so hard to do. It's just, you know, a slight change in the way teachers assess their students. So just to make it more frequent in
Yep.
smaller pieces, but giving less emphasis on the grades, because the
Yep.
grade is, how can I say that? Grade is the worst form of feedback we have to
Right.
give to our students. And they can be so demotivating, right?
Mhm.
They can
Yeah.
be uh, counterproductive. Instead of stimulating learning, they might, hamper learning initiatives at all.
Yeah.
So this is perhaps one of the reasons why I started studying something called cognitive diagnostic modeling. And
Mhm.
that opens the door for another story.
Yeah, yeah. So, and even on that front though, with the testing, the grades, what you're saying is it can be misleading too, right? Because you're not getting the feedback you're getting is perhaps not representative of your cognitive capabilities. Maybe to your point, you're just memorizing something and regurgitating it, and then you're getting a grade for it, right? Which
Yeah.
is often misleading. Um, so this whole I do want to come back to the what's the model you said? Cognitive diagnostical
Yeah.
model?
Cognitive diagnostic modeling.
Yeah.
The idea of studying cognitive diagnostic modeling came from this request of a person in the community. Uh, so a person who is not from the academic world, and I will not share her name due to privacy issues,
Yep.
but she had a stroke. She had a ruptured aneurysm, and she happens to be winner of a hackathon
Mm,
for health. So IT or other kind of non-techy but still useful solutions for healthcare. So a hackathon for healthcare, and she was a winner in previous editions. And um, a couple of months after the stroke, she was still debilitated, but she came up and went to the hackathon, and she proposed an app. And the idea of the app was to accelerate the rehabilitation of people who, just like her, had aphasia after a stroke or, let's say, a brain trauma. So the idea
mhm,
was to have some kind of speech therapy app that could adjust the exercises according to your aphasia.
mhm,
And I was happy that, a colleague of mine was in the hackathon. I was having a Heineken. It was Friday evening, and I received a call from this colleague from this other department, and he said, "Well, you're the guy who works with computerized adaptive testing." I said, "Yeah. Well, I think we can use this kind of algorithm for this pitch that we have here about this, app that would give adaptive exercises for speech therapy and the rehabilitation of people with aphasia." And then I said, "Wow, that seems excellent, right?" So I went there. There was a nice team. We won the local competition, but not the national competition. For the national
mhm.
competition, we were just runner ups. So we
Yeah.
got the second place. But still, the jury was very kind and said that we had to do it. It was too important for us not to do it.
Mhm.
And then, um, the leader there, the owner of the initiative, she corrected me at one point because I thought that the adjustment that she needed in this app was just related to the difficulty level of the exercises. But she
Mhm.
actually wanted me to also adapt the content
Mhm.
towards the kind of deficits that she needed to work on, which was an entirely different approach. The
Right.
algorithm that I had at my hand was not going to help her because my algorithm would just adapt the difficulty, but not the content. We can specify the content we want, but
Yeah.
beforehand. So we can
Mm,
determine, the content specifications according to a test blueprint, but we cannot adapt the content. At least we couldn't at that time. But then I realized that the trick would not, function using just item response theory, which was the psychometric paradigm used in this first generation of computerized adaptive tests. With her demands, with her correction, I realized I had to study cognitive diagnostic modeling because it was the only kind of algorithm that could allow me to also adapt for the content. And
right.
then, I came up with the knowledge of this very interesting, deceased professor, Kikumi Tatsuoka. She worked many years in the US, and she came up with this very unquestionable truth that
Mm,
two students, let's say with the same grade, 7 out of 10, you name it, but two students with the same grade, they can have a very different set of strengths and weaknesses. And if we want to be, rational in terms of how we conduct our education and how we conduct our assessment,
mm,
just giving away grades, just giving away numbers doesn't make the cut, right?
right.
You have to specify the strengths and the weaknesses. So cognitive diagnostic modeling came up in my life first as a way to help, in the hackathon. But then
Yeah.
later on, I realized that, oh, this has a lot of potential in education. And there are some initiatives using cognitive diagnostic modeling, not only in education, but also in healthcare. So
Hmm.
I'm very proud that, this journey led me to the opportunity of having written this paper about cognitive diagnostic modeling, which is a kind of pamphlet opening the eyes of people for the importance of not restricting their feedback to numbers, to grades, and
Right.
making words more important. And I think the magic there is that we now know that narrative, qualitative information has a lot of strength in feedback
Right.
if you know how to do it. So
Hmm.
the idea of working with cognitive diagnostic modeling was to come up with a compromise, a middle situation where I can still have a robust approach to demonstrate mathematically what were the attributes or competencies or skills that the test takers were able or not to demonstrate in a probabilistic manner, but also providing this rich, more qualitative feedback instead of just a number.
Right.
The book that became a movie, the Guardians of the Galaxy, where they ask, "What's the meaning of life, the universe, and everything?"
Yeah.
And then the computer, after a lot of calculations, spits out 42, right?
Yeah.
That isn't this number, doesn't tell
Yeah.
us
Yeah.
anything, right? So one of the battles that I have, I think one of the good battles that I have participated is this search for ways in which we can stimulate teachers to use assessments in a more strategic, in a more effective, in a more, you know, uh, attractive, also in a funnier way, less punitive, less traumatic way. And I think, the insights I got from psychometrics allowed me to have this understanding of how flawed our current assessments in education
Right.
is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate you touching on both the qualitative and quantitative side of it because we lose sight of the qualitative side of being able to assess. And yeah, it's so important. And thank you for pointing that out. I do want to come back to the whole idea of how data can be manipulated as I was touching on
Yeah.
earlier. But
Yeah.
you did touch on it a little bit. Even when you're kind of looking at data and it's, if you want to make it valid, I'm sure you can manipulate it to make it look valid. Or even from a perspective of when you're trying to do some correlations, often what I heard or I've seen too is you can look at the correlations and then draw your conclusions and change your hypothesis to support the data, which is all obviously the backward way of doing things. And it's not always ethical either. But what are your thoughts around that and this whole
Well,
notion?
there is a large umbrella named questionable research practices.
Yeah.
And these are just some of them. There are many others.
Yeah.
And what's scary is that questionable research practices are very pervasive throughout all the disciplines. That's a bad thing. So
Hmm.
I think the first discipline who took a huge hit was psychology,
Yeah.
which is, what I did for my master's and my PhD. So I
Yeah.
started, my postgraduate studies in psychology more or less, well, still before the replication crisis.
Hmm.
When I started my PhD, I was in the eye of the hurricane because a very famous teacher here in the Netherlands, Diederik Stapel, he was fired from Tilburg University because he was just falsifying data, fake data. He was publishing
Mm.
things based on fake data. And students realized it. The students were the ones who denounced it. So there are many people who will not have, scruples. I don't know, that's the word, but
Yeah. Yeah.
they will do everything they need to get more publications than their peers, because in the end of the day, even though there's a lot of talk about slow science, in the end of the day, what gets you a promotion, what gets you a better salary, what gets you more power is the number of publications and
Right.
citations. So a lot
For
of
sure.
people are attracted to the idea of publishing, no matter at what cost. And good research, we know it takes time. It takes
Hmm.
time to be, prepared, planned, executed, and written.
Yeah.
And we have, many predatory journals out there, predatory publishers, even. So questionable research practice, they are actually, very pervasive, and they're just an indication that a lot of people are not just doing the right thing for the wrong reason, but they're also doing the wrong thing for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
And this is bad because this maculates uh, the entire idea of science, right?
Hmm.
Um, of being something that is there for us to seek the truth of things.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of questionable research practices going on. And nowadays, we know that it's not just because something gets published that it's something good. You
Right.
might get crap being published, even in, re, respected journals out there. And
Yeah.
later on, we get the retraction. So, retraction watch, for example, is something I used a lot.
Yeah.
Just to check, because there are many things that are discovered after publication, after the peer reviewing was done. And, um, one of the things that I think are, this is perhaps the key to understand this is the ego of the
Yeah.
scientists, right?
Yeah.
And then you have, pride, ambition, um, the idea of being remembered, the idea of being important, the idea of being
Yeah.
recognized. And then, you know, uh, I think most academics don't stop to think why we do what we do, right?
Yeah.
Why am I doing this? Is it really for, the greater good, or is it just for my CV? And unfortunately, I think a large parcel of scientists are more focused on having a thick curriculum than, really making a positive difference. And nowadays, I see with some sympathy that there are countries that are trying to value other things besides publications. There is a
Yeah.
very early initiative here in the Netherlands that is trying to take into account your performance in education and also your impact on society, not just in terms of publication, but in terms of, real impacts, in terms of, what your work has resulted for the good of the people. And
Right.
I see this initiative of changing the rules of the game a little bit with a lot of sympathy because, you know, there's more out there than just publications. I mean, good science has to be published because it's like putting good art in the attic. If you have a good study that you have not published for some reason, try to make it published somehow, somewhere, because good science deserves to be appreciated by others. But at the same time, I see, a lot of people just putting things out there that are not going to be relevant, are not going to be, you know, useful. It's just for the matter of having another entry in your CV, which is a shame. I mean, and it's still something very common, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And
But I think there's sorry, just another piece though, because there's an aspect of also maybe it's not questionable practice, but you could be biased because you've been working on something for so many years and you may just draw conclusions because you have that blind spot, right? And it's often good to have another person maybe question the conclusions you're drawing because you're so stuck in it, right? It's like the idea of our own opinions and beliefs. We get so stuck in and we have tunnel vision that we don't often look at other evidence that would support against it. So maybe it's not even the person doing something unethical. It's just they're just so blind. They're just so stuck in their own vision that they don't see the evidence against their hypothesis.
sometimes I think that, one of the most challenging jobs that you have is to be the editor of a
Yeah.
scientific journal. Not so much the publisher, but the editor. Because in the end of the
Mhm.
day, it's about, the editor being the gatekeeper of this new knowledge that was produced and
Right.
whether it is meritful, whether it deserves to be analyzed, to be scrutinized by the outside world or not. And sometimes I think that some editors misuse their position to censor divergent opinions, divergent views, or theoretical frameworks that they don't agree with so much. Um, and I kind of I kind of understand them because I
Yeah.
think power can be, something overwhelming sometimes. But I think editors have this obligation of using their power sensibly, ethically, especially when it comes, to things like publication bias, for example. There is a tendency in editors, and I think it's kind of unconscious, to publish papers that have significant results. So if we were to think about the distribution of p-values, it should be something more or less like this. I'm not sure if the direction is right, but it should go down. And when we
Yeah.
see the frequency of p-values in the literature, instead of going down like this, goes up before going down again. So
Yeah.
there is a huge publication bias towards publication of studies that show a significant difference. And sometimes negative results can also be useful, right?
Mhm.
When you say that there
Right.
is no relationship between two variables, that might
Correct.
be also useful for policy, but it doesn't get published as often
Right.
because of the publication bias of the editors who have this tendency of just publishing positive results. They even
Yeah.
created a journal specifically for negative results because of this publication bias.
Mhm.
So science is not perfect because humans are not
Yeah.
perfect, right?
Of course. course. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I do have one more question for you, and that's kind of more so for people that are often given data or conclusions. What are some things they can do? And one of the, I was talking about it earlier too. One of the things I do, for example, is look at the sample size and how representative it is, and often need to scrutinize the conclusions based on that. The other thing, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. In that book, they talk about how often data is represented in a certain way to seem attractive or be a deterrent in terms of how you just represent the numbers. It could be as simple as 1 in 20 people, or, or more of as a fraction and something like that. Or sorry, no, what is it? One in 5 or 20%, right? If you look at that, it could give you a different reaction, right? So being aware of those things, but what are some things people can do when they're reviewing data like that?
Well, I'm going to quote Homer Simpson. He said that you can use statistics to prove any point.
Yeah.
70% of the people know that. So you see, I think well, I haven't really thought through about a stepwise approach to critically analyze, scientific studies or uh, papers that come out. But I think we can always assume that unless otherwise noted, it is crap because
Yeah. Yeah.
that's the healthy way, of reading papers. So you have always to assume that the sample is not representative, that the sample size was insufficient, that the study was not powered enough because of the small sample size. You have
Yep.
to think about cherry picking. You have to
Mhm.
think about hypothesizing after you have the results. You have to
Yeah.
think about, p hacking, that kind of thing. Um, so you have to always think about all the worst possibilities because, expectation is the mother of frustration, right? So if you
Right.
expect that everything is going to be rightly done, most likely you're going to be frustrated. So in science, I think we are allowed to be critical. That's the
Mhm.
mainstay of science. And if you have a critical look at all the aspects of the article, including things like, for example, pre-registration.
Mm.
If a study is pre-registered, it's most likely good, right?
Right.
Because you cannot change the course of things as they go. So pre-registration is important. Replicability is important. So
Mhm.
things are open. If the data is open, if the code used to generate the results is open, if everything is open, including open access of the paper, things are more transparent. So the more transparency you have since the pre-registration phase, the more open science is, the less prone the result, will be compromised by questionable research practices. So the idea of making, things like pre-registration, open access, open science as a whole, the idea is to improve reproducibility, reduce the possibility of questionable research practices. And then I think we have a starting point, you know, um, to make science trustworthy again. Because right now, I think there is a huge credibility problem with science, with so many divergent voices, with so many papers being published without, good standards, with so many predatory journals. For the public, it might be very difficult to tell between what is good science and what is bad science. But one
Right.
thing I can tell you for sure is that good science is open for criticism. Good
Mhm.
science is open for independent scrutiny, right? So this idea that
Yeah.
oh, just because it's scientific or somebody said it's scientific, you have to believe it. No, no, right? The idea is that scientists or science minded people, they have to be able to make tough questions. They have to be able to inspect and criticize. And one of the things I realized, you know, perhaps too late in life, is that most people don't care about evidence,
Mhm.
including scientific evidence. Why?
Right.
Why? And one of the reasons I think people discredit evidence is when evidence is against their beliefs.
Right.
And
Yep.
people have usually very strong held beliefs about certain topics. Not about all topics, but certain topics are, fire
Yep.
flammable because, certain topics are really taboo, and those topics that are, more sensitive, people tend to have strongly held beliefs about them.
Right.
And when you have such a strong belief about how certain things work or how certain things should be, any evidence that goes against your belief will not only be interpreted as a negative evidence against your belief, but also a threat to your
Mhm.
very sense of personal identity.
Right.
And that's a big problem because then you shut off the rational brain and you start using your reptile brain.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then things become furious because it's not,
Mhm.
a rational argument anymore. It really becomes a violent clash. And, if people are yelling, nobody's being wise, right? So now we still are people yelling and fighting and arguing about opposing views, but nobody cares so much about the evidence. After all, there's a lot of absence of evidence, which is
Right.
different from evidence of absence, right? A lot of
Yep.
tend to confuse those two things. Just because
For
you don't
sure.
have the evidence that, there is evidence of non-existence of something. And there is this kind of peculiar way to which we relate to risks,
Mhm.
right? Because, if you want to have a very high level of, how can I say that? Sensitivity about detecting a problem, you will inevitably have a problem with specificity, right? There is a
Mhm.
trade off there. But we as scientists, we tend to have such high methodological uh, levels of rigor. We have such a high level of methodological rigor that we might neglect existing risks. We might
Mhm.
neglect existing problems that are out there. And there's this German sociologist who wrote a lot about that. His name is Ulrich Beck, if my memory is not wrong. So the idea that sometimes there is also an illogic in the way we perceive and treat danger,
Right.
scientific way. Sometimes, we might perhaps too lenient to certain dangers, to certain risks, because of a very high methodological standard in terms of
Right.
science. And then we might think, oh, this is a negligible risk, negligible risk. But one of the problems that we have in statistics is that most of the variance we care about is the between subjects variance. So we're
Yep.
always making comparisons between groups. So was the treatment group with a higher value than the control group? We are
Yep.
always making comparisons at the group level, but how does it work for the person? And
Mhm.
and that approach centered on the person and not just cross-sectionally as a picture, of time where we just
Right.
make the study once, but making, an intensive longitudinal follow-up of the people throughout time, then sometimes, I still think that we could do a better job in terms of assessing individual trajectories, the
Yeah.
within subjects variance. And I think this is
Yeah.
something that is true for education, for healthcare. We can still do a much better job at the individual level because most of
Yeah.
the inferences, most of, you know, statistical practice that we have to approve medication are still based on this cross-sectional approach that insists so much on the between subjects variance and not so much on the within person's
Yeah.
variance.
And to your point, the longitudinal studies, I mean, those are more relevant for sure, but they're also time consuming, as you can appreciate, and costly, right? So I think that's the other side of it. And there's that aspect of what you were saying earlier around critical thinking and people being fearful of having their beliefs challenged. That's, you know, another area of artificial intelligence that I kind of worry about for people. But I don't know if that's what your thoughts are on AI coming in with a lot of the changes and the evolutions, but that'll be an interesting place to see where the world goes.
Well, I think artificial intelligence poses both an opportunity and a threat, right?
Yeah.
It has strengths and it has weaknesses. So I think it all starts with the intention. What's the intention behind things? So I can foresee a world that can have a lot of help from artificial intelligence, but I can also foresee a dystopic future, right?
Yeah.
People are not able to distinguish between a text that was produced by an authentic person and a text or an image that was produced by an AI. So I
Yeah.
think we'll have a problem in terms of, recognizing what is genuine, what is authentic, and what is not.
Yeah.
Um, I can also foresee that people will feel more or less in a cage or a grid because of AI. I'm afraid that this might also happen with education,
Mm,
where we are more or less monitored all the time. But in the end, we are already. Our cell phones are not just ectopic brains that we use to help our memory. They're also
right.
tracking devices, right? So I think we are already living in the grid in a certain way, and that's
Yeah.
not
Agreed.
so uncomfortable. But in the end, it's already happening. But the legitimacy problem, or the difficulty in terms of distinguishing what is fake from what is real, I think this is going to be, you know, one of the crucial things that will define this century. We are going to have troubles, I think, with the news.
Hmm.
I think we're going to have trouble with mass media. I think we are going to have trouble in terms of misinformation, disinformation,
Yeah.
and it's going to be much harder for people to engage into, any significant social movements, for example. It's going to be tougher, I think, for people to complain against oppressive things. I think people will tend to lose freedom or liberty. I don't know. Um, so yeah, it can be scary. It can be quite
Yeah.
scary.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I tried to think, okay, we have a lot of bad algorithms out there. We have a lot of algorithms sucking our attention. I think everybody saw the social dilemma, right?
Yeah.
So I think if we cannot eliminate the bad algorithms, maybe we can make good use of the existing ones and try to occupy that space, right?
Yeah.
So I can think of good AI algorithms that could benefit from children to the elderly, making their lives more meaningful, less stressful, helping them manage things better. So I think, we can learn a lot with AI, we can make assessments less traumatic, less punitive, more fun. And I think that's the way to go. I think we have to, counteract those bad TikTok algorithms or Instagram algorithms.
Yeah,
We have
for
to have
sure.
better algorithms that, occupy the attention of our kids in a healthier way that will make a useful difference for them in the future. And maybe that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, so that not only I can help academics become, better researchers by the use of statistics and psychometrics, but also maybe help people with an entrepreneurial spirit who also see this opportunity, to make more algorithms, more AI that can benefit education, that can make learning fun,
Yeah.
and assessment is also fun because in the end, it's going to be, I think, if we use AI appropriately, I think the distinction between what's assessment and what's instruction is going to be so blurred that you'll never have a test again. It's
Right.
going to be just exercises and fun.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
my
No,
dream.
I appreciate that, Carlos. And it's probably a good place to end. But thank you so much for coming on here and having this conversation with me. Uh, really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot too. So thank you again. And for listeners that do want to get a hold of you, what are some ways they can do that, whether it's online or social media? Speaking of social media.
Well, I think the best place where you can find me is in the uh, Psychometrics Academy profile on Instagram. You can just write Psychometrics Academy. On Twitter, we are just Psychometrics A. That's our handle there. On YouTube, our handle is also Psychometrics Academy. I think on LinkedIn, you can also find us as Psychometrics Academy. And also on TikTok, I think you can also find us there
Okay.
with
I'll put all of that in the
less,
show notes.
less serious content.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you for coming on here.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It was really a pleasure. I think, it was my first podcast. So I hope I can do more of this in the future. I was a bit afraid, but it's not that hard.
No, you did fine. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you for checking out this episode with Carlos. As always, please leave a review or a comment in the comment section. I always love hearing from you. And please subscribe to the podcast if you already haven't done so. That's the best way to support this podcast. And until next week.